Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H event space. You are tuned in to Intro to Lighting Part 3, Speedlights, hosted by Sony. And for that, I'd like to welcome Sony Artisan of Imagery, as you see right there on the screen, Tony Gale. Tony, how's it going?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
Doing just fine. You know that you are one of the first people who educated me on the various uses of a speedlight. So I'm just going to throw that little piece of information in there that you are all in great hands for the next hour or so. So, Tony, I will leave it to you. I'll open the floor for any questions that anybody has throughout. You can get them into the comment section there on YouTube. If you haven't checked us out on YouTube, please do. Just look up B&H Event Space on YouTube. And Tony, I'll see you in a bit for some Q&A.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. I am Tony Gale. I'm a Sony Artisan of Imagery. Probably many of you know that already. And this, as Derek said, is Intro to Lighting Part 3 of 5 Speedlights, thanks to Sony and the B&H event space. Without both of them, we wouldn't be here. In addition to being a Sony Artisan of Imagery, I'm a BenQ ambassador and Manfrotto ambassador at X-Rite Colorado, just in case any of those come up. And I'm a commercial photographer based here in New York City. Coming up, we have parts 4 and 5 of this series, Intro to Lighting Part 4, Strobes, and Intro to Lighting Part 5, Mixed Lighting. After that, we were just talking about some ideas off before we went online. So there will be more stuff coming up. We're just figuring it out. In addition to parts 4 and 5 of this, there's a bunch of other cool stuff with the B&H event space and Sony. Chris Orwig's doing a lot, Michael Taylor, Mahesh Thepa, Scott Robert Lim, a bunch of great people doing a bunch of cool stuff. So if you're interested in seeing more things and maybe you don't want to only listen to me, take a look. There's a bunch of stuff there. Also, as I mention every time, Sony's Alpha Universe website is a great resource to just learn more about photography, learn more about Sony. But even if you don't use Sony, there's a lot of great information there talking about different techniques and different ways to do different things and just inspirational stuff. Additionally, there's the Sony Alpha Universe forums, also available through Alpha Universe. They're free. It's a welcoming space. It's moderated. People are nice, so you can ask a question and people won't tell you to read the manual. It's a very friendly space. Additionally, Sony has the Sony Alpha Female Plus program. It's a Facebook group. Also a welcoming space. Every week they do a $500 micro grant based around a specific topic. So they'll post whatever the topic is, and you could post a picture and potentially win a $500 grant. You don't have to identify as female to be a part of the group. I am part of the group, and you don't have to identify as female to win. But I would recommend that you be a nice person. Also, just to point out, there's a ton of cool Sony stuff out there. I'm going to be talking about some specific things, especially specific flashes. But if you're looking for something new, there's a lot of great stuff. They recently announced the Sony 1625 f2.8G compact lens. You may think 16 to 25 is an odd focal length, and it is certainly unusual. But the reason for it is it's a compact lens. So with something like the Alpha 7CR, the Alpha 7C2, which are compact full frame cameras, it's a small lens to go with that so that it doesn't take up a lot of space. It doesn't weigh much, but it's still sharp and it's still an excellent lens. And the Sony Alpha 9 III was announced in the fall. It just was released a couple months ago. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about this camera, both on this talk today and in the one in the next few weeks. With strobe, global shutter, it is magic. It is absolutely magic what you can do with this camera. Additionally, Sony's Imaging Pro Support Program, if you are someone who makes some money from photography, you don't have to be full-time, but you do have to make some money from photography, and you have whatever the minimum amount of gear is, it says, you can join for $100 a year. It gets you free, let's see, it gets you up to 3 complimentary clean-in checks per membership year with 2 eligible products. It gets you expedited repairs. It gets you discount on repairs. It gets you free loaners if the repair is going to be longer than 3 days, I believe. It's really a great program. It's $100. If you qualify, it's worth taking a look at. All right. One of the things I often say in these is that we are in an exciting time to be photographers. And I do believe that's true. There are things that we can do now that just weren't possible in the past. When I started with photography, a good speedlight was nowhere near as good as a good speedlight now. The technology that's available to us, both in cameras and lighting, is fantastic. It's a great time to be experimenting. It's a great time to be playing. It's a great time to be making new and exciting work. All right, intro to lighting, part 3 of 5, speedlights, which is on-camera flash. A lot of people think of flash as just, a speedlight as a flash is just something you put on your camera, get that direct flash look, but it can be used off camera. It can be used for more exciting things. This is a picture of my daughter. So speedlights are a lot more versatile than just the on-camera flash look. It is true that feels like every 10 or 15 years, that commercial on-camera flash looks comes back. And for a while, everybody thinks it's the coolest thing. And then nobody likes it anymore. And then 10 or 15 years later, it comes back. As I've said in every one of these, lighting is a big topic. All light sources have some similarities. Natural light, available light, constant light, speed light, strobes, mixed light. They all have similarities, but they can vary in color, intensity, shape, etc. So there's some things I have been repeating in every one of these talks and will continue to do so because of those similarities, but there are also differences. So first of all, what are speedlights? Speedlights are the external on-camera flashes that you can buy for your camera. So I wouldn't really call the pop-up flash in your camera, if you have one, like the Alpha 6400 has a pop-up flash, I wouldn't call that a speedlight. To me, a speedlight is an external thing that is designed to fit on the hot shoe of your camera or the cold shoe of your camera. Why use speedlights? They're compact and portable. They typically run off easily available AA batteries. So if you are almost anywhere in the world and you need more batteries, they're available. I tend to use rechargeables, but if I run out of rechargeables, regular AA's are everywhere. They're pretty powerful for their size, and they are very compact. So here is my Alpha 7 R4, I believe. Just to give you a sense, 3 speedlights take up about as much space as one camera with a 90 macro lens. So they are very compact and portable for the amount of power that they put out. Why might you not want to use speedlights? They definitely have less power than your standard strobe, and especially less power than a bigger, more expensive strobe. There are modifiers available for speedlights because of their size, though, and because of the limited power that they have. There aren't the wide range of modifiers that might be available for strobes. All right, so let's talk about quality of light and quantity of light. So quality of light is the character and softness or hardness of light, more or less. So it's the light direct, is it indirect, is it modified? So it's not a value judgment on light. You don't have good quality. Well, you might describe something as good quality of light, but it's not an absolute. So on the left here, I have a hard light. It's just speedlight, just a bare speedlight directly at these bleeding hearts. On the right, speedlight's in the same position. It's just using a shoot-through umbrella. So we have hard light on the left, soft light on the right. That is an example of quality of light, hard versus soft. And then we also have quantity of light. How much light is there? So more light on the left, less light on the right. That's quality of light. So if you hear people talking about quality or quantity of light, that's what those mean. With speedlights as well, you get into a tricky thing, which is guide numbers. So guide numbers are a confusing thing. A guide number for a flash or for a speedlight is the guide number equals the F number times distance. Most of the time, that distance is in meters. Sometimes it's in feet. So for example, if you're at f2.8 and your subject is 10 meters away, you need a flash with a guide number of at least 28 to light it correctly. This is also typically guide numbers are calculated at ISO 100. So as you boost your ISO, that changes. If you're at f4 at 10 meters, you need a flash with a guide number of 40. The only reason I mention this is because when you buy a flash, they typically tell you what the guide number is. I don't think it's that useful to know, except in the context of a Sony with like the HVL F60RM2, the 60 is the guide number for that flash. It is more powerful than the HVL F46RM, for example. 60 is a higher number than the 46. It's a more powerful flash. And it's also, if you dive into it, they'll tell you how that guide number was calculated. So with the HVL F60RM2, the maximum guide number is 60. If the flash is set to 200 millimeters on the zoom with standard flash distribution at ISO 100 in meters. So that's just a rough primer on guide number. It's not that important to know. It used to be more important when flashes weren't so smart, but bigger number, more powerful flash, lower number, less powerful flash. All right, so Speedlights. I'm a Sony Artisan of Imagery. I use Sony Speedlights. A lot of what I'm talking about is applicable no matter what Speedlight you use. There will be things that are specific to the Sony Speedlights, but I assume other Speedlights do those things. And then when I talk about very specific things like how to control it through the camera, that's obviously a Sony thing. But overall, whether or not you use Sony, hopefully this will be useful to you. So if you look, there are currently 5 Sony Speedlights on the B&H website. All of these screenshots with prices were done yesterday and last week. So they should be current, but depending on when you're watching this, prices change all the time. So you have the HVL F60RM2. For those of you who are curious, because I was, HVL stands for hybrid video light. F is flash, 60 is the guide number. R is radio, M is multi-interface shoe, 2 is the second version. You'll notice that some of these, like the 60RM2 on the upper left, has the R. The F20M right next to it does not have an R. The R means it can be radio controlled and communicate with other flashes via radio. If it does not have the R, it cannot. It uses optical pulses. There are ways around that, but if you're in the market for a flash, I would really encourage you to only buy flashes that have a radio built in. You're still going to need a way to control it, so you'll need another flash on the camera or a transmitter or whatever. But you have a lot more control and a lot more flexibility with a radio built into the flash than one without. And I typically use the 60RM2, the 46RM, and then if I need something small, I have the 28RM. As you're looking for Speedlights and looking at what to buy, take a look at the specs. So you can see guide number is usually the top thing. And it tells you how it's calculated. It'll tell you if it has a bounce head or not. So a bounce head is a head that can move vertically, sometimes back, and sometimes rotate. That's the swivel head. So something like this 60RM2 has a bounce head and a swivel head. It also has the quick shift bounce where it rotates the other way, which is the only flash that I'm aware of that does that is the 60s. Something like the 20M does not have a swivel head. It just rotates, or it just has a bit of a bounce head. It tells you how, if it's got a radio and what the range is, tells you what the batteries are. So I said most Speedlights use AA's, but the 20M uses AAA's, 2 AAA's. It'll tell you if it has an off-camera terminal. So if you need to hook up a sync cord to the HVL F60RM2, you can. With the 20M, you cannot. There's a whole range of information. I'm not going to read you all the specs, but take a look, make sure that you understand what you're buying. Because why spend money on something that you don't need? Most important, make sure that you're buying a flash that is correct for your camera. With Sony, I like to use the radio commander rather than a flash. You can use a Sony radio flash on your camera to control other flashes, either off camera or multiple flashes. I prefer to just use the radio and let my flashes be flashes off camera. This will control up to 5 groups of flashes and up to 15 total lights. I don't have 15. I've never done that many, but it's pretty cool. And I did mention that Sony Speedlights without the R for radio can't be used for radio. They can if you get this as an adapter. So if you already have Sony Speedlights that don't have a radio built in, you can buy this radio receiver that will then allow them to work with radios. I would still say, though, if you are buying a new flash, just get one with the radio. I also really like the external battery pack. It works with the 60RM and the 60RM2 and the old 60M, if you still have that. This is the Sony multi-interface shoe. So I mentioned you want to make sure that you get a speed light that is appropriate for your camera. The Sony Speedlights, there's that series of pins there at the top to help it communicate with the camera. If you buy a speedlight for another brand and put it on your Sony, for example, it will still work in that it will still fire, probably. I can't guarantee everyone will because of that center pin in the middle, but it will only work on manual. It won't work on TTL. It won't work in high-speed sync. All right. So one of the cool things with Sony's, this started, I think, with the Alpha 7R3, certainly everything in the last several years. If you're using a radio commander or a flash on your camera and you want to control multiple flashes, you can change those settings in the menu rather than doing it on the flash itself. It's a lot easier. We'll get into that in a second. I'm jumping ahead because we'll get to that, but I jumped ahead. So in your camera, you have flash mode, you have fill flash, you have slow sync, you have rear sync, you have flash compensation. So flash compensation works like exposure compensation. For those of you who are familiar with exposure compensation, if you're in auto, you can turn exposure compensation up or down to make things brighter or darker. Flash compensation does the same thing. If you're in TTL and you want your flash to be brighter, you can turn it up or you can turn it down if you want it to be darker. Wireless flash on. I typically turn this on my Sony Speedlights because if I use Pro Photo triggers, they want wireless flash to be on. And if you want to use Sony flashes off camera, you want wireless flash to be on. I have been told by people when I've done presentations before that some brands of transmitters do not want wireless flash on. So you'll have to investigate for yourself if you're using, say, a Westcott or Godox or something. I can't speak to those, but I always turn it on. And then this is where I was mentioning. So external flash set. With external flash set, you can control your groups. You can tell it if you want everything controlled individually, if you want it to be manual, if you want it to be TTL, all that stuff. Groups, remote release is a way that you can use your flash to trigger a camera. High-speed sync on and off. Flash power, depending on the flash, from 1 to 1, which is full power, to 1/128th or 1/256th. Ratios, if you're going to use TTL, TTL is through the lens. We'll get into some more of what all that means. So you can turn the ratio value up. So a higher number, it's brighter relative to the others. If you're using a flash that is not dedicated to your camera, so let's say that you picked up a used Vivitar 283 at Goodwill, and you want to use that on your camera. First of all, be careful with the trigger voltage. Some older flashes, the trigger voltage might be high and it might be bad for your camera. But if it's a flash that your camera can't communicate with, so if it's a Sony camera and you don't have those multi-interface shoe pins, your camera doesn't know that there's a flash on the camera, so everything's going to look dark like this. So what you want to do is go in to your menu and turn set live view display setting effect off. I have my custom 1 button set to turn that off on most of my cameras because I do use triggers that don't communicate like that. I have an old Pro Photo trigger, for example, that doesn't have the pins. And if you have live view display setting effect off, then everything gets brighter and you can see what you're doing. All right, so starting out, how do you want to use the flash? Like we said, the direct flash, that's the obvious way to do it. And there are reasons to do that. If you're an event photographer, for example, often it's just the most expedient. Maybe you like the look. There's reasons to do that. So upper left, direct flash, boom. Upper right, flash is just bounced directly into the ceiling. So the light is softer. You can see it's very harsh on the upper left. It's softer on the upper right. The colors also change because it's bouncing off of a warmer white wall. But there's a little raccoon eyes. You can see my eyes are getting a little shadowy. Lower left, the speed light, it's bounced back a little and up. So it's a little bit more flattering of an angle. And then lower right, it's bounced to the side. So this is where that swivel and tilt come into play. If you're in a room that allows for it and you're photographing a person or a thing and you're not running around like crazy, I really, really recommend bouncing. I think it's much more flattering light. All right, I'm going quick because I put way too much in here, as I tend to do. I'm just trying to cover everything. Let's talk about the difference between TTL and manual. So TTL is through the lens, or ETTL. And what that is the flash and the camera communicating to tell the flash how much power to output. In manual, you're telling the flash how much power to output, and it's doing that regardless of everything else. So you can see on the top with the Alpha 1, 2470. In TTL, all three of those pictures as I get closer to the camera are pretty much a similar exposure, right? That's because the TTL, as I move, the camera knows that it sends a pre-flash. So when you hit the shutter, it sends a flash. It measures that very quickly, and then it sends the real flash based on that output. On the bottom, it's on manual, so you can see it gets progressively brighter as I get closer to the camera. It's more or less right on the left, a little bit too bright, much too bright, because I haven't changed the power. So as I get closer, it just gets brighter. So if you're photographing something that's moving, TTL might be the answer. One of the disadvantages with TTL is that pre-flash. So if you're photographing something where timing is perfect, where it needs to be absolutely spot on, if you hit the shutter when the moment happens, that photo is actually taken a fraction of a second later because of that pre-flash. However, that's not necessarily the case with every camera anymore. If the flash is off camera, it's going to be the case in TTL. If it is on camera and you're using some of the newest Sonys, the Alpha 7R5, the Alpha 1, the Alpha 9 III, I assume some of the other ones, but I can't say for sure. The camera is communicating with the flash, if it's on camera and direct, has to be direct and on camera. It's communicating with the camera, and it is basing the output of the flash on the focus point. So it knows that we focused 9.7 feet away. So it's going to output the right amount of light to expose something correctly that is 9.7 feet away. So you don't have that pre-flash anymore, which is a pretty incredible feature that, as far as I know, is unique to those newer Sony cameras. It's possible that other people do that as well. I haven't heard of it. But it can speed things up and make you just that much more reactive so that your timing isn't something that you have to anticipate that fraction of a second. It's really quite a cool feature. Some differences between TTL and manual here. It's a little darker. Then as I get closer, it's getting brighter, brighter. Same thing as before, TTL on the top, manual on the bottom. I move closer, it gets brighter in manual. I move closer, it's kind of the same in TTL. All right, let's talk about what fill flash, slow sync, and rear sync mean. So fill flash on Sony's is just normal flash. I don't know why they call it fill flash. It's just normal flash. So this is a picture, no flash, manual 5.6, ISO 200 at 200th of a second. Adding in direct flash. Outside, part of the reason you might use fill flash. So here, like my eyes are much too shadowy. It's not a flattering picture. We've added flash. There's some catch light in my eyes. They're not too shadowy anymore, but it might be too much. So this is where you can use that flash compensation. Here we have direct flash, underexposed one stop. Camera set to manual, everything. So if you compare that to this, too dark, maybe too bright, sort of in between, fill flash is very useful for that kind of thing. Direct flash, boosting the shutter speed and the f-stop. So instead of balancing with the background feeling bright, now it's dark, even though it's the same moment. That's where you can control things because you're able to control everything with your f-stop. If you change your f-stop with flash, everything gets brighter or darker. The ambient, if you're outside, for example, or inside. If you change your shutter speed, only the ambient gets darker, the flash doesn't. We'll demonstrate that, so you can make a dramatic difference just by doing that. All right, so direct flash, Still using fill flash, still using fill flash. This ball here, so let me go back. We're at 1/200th of a second. We're at 1/10th of a second. Because sometimes you want to use flash to freeze motion or to show motion. This ball is falling down. It looks like it's flying up, right? That's because when you're on fill flash, the flash fires at the beginning of the exposure. So the flash fired as the ball was up here. Then as the shutter continues to stay open, the ball falls down. So it feels like the streak, it's going in the direction of the streak, but it feels like the ball is going up because in our heads, we associate that streak with being behind something. So that's slow sync. What you might consider is rear sync. So rear sync, slow sync, rear sync. Rear sync, instead of firing the flash at the beginning of the exposure, it fires it at the end. So here, same thing, 1/10th of a second, the ball is being dropped. It's going in the direction it feels like because the flash fired at the end of the exposure rather than the beginning. So the streak is behind it. So you can see it here. If that's something you want to do, you kind of need something light colored on a darker background. So this tennis ball on the left, you can see it. If you look really closely on the right, you can see a little bit of a blue streak, but the dark blue is so dark against the black, it sort of gets lost. And if you try and do a similar thing on a light colored background, it just gets muddy and lost. And then if you're like, yeah, this could be better. Here I've added a flag. So the reason that there's that streak is because I also have an ambient light. We'll get into this some more when we do mixed lighting in the last session. But I've flagged off some of the light from the background, so now that color is more dramatic. And I've just put some paper wrapped around the flash as a snoot to also keep light off the background, and now it's even more dramatic. And you can do fun things like which I've been seeing a lot of people doing lately, dragging the shutter and moving something where the shadow side is lit by a constant light and the highlight side is lit by a strobe. This is just zooming. You also, on your flash, if you have a Sony flash, have something called multi. And multi tells the flash to fire multiple times in each exposure. So here, for example, hertz is how many times per second the flash would fire. Except it's firing 5 times, but the hertz is 10. So, and then 1/32 is the power. So you've got all that. I changed here, it's 30 hertz, 3 times, 1/32 power. So there we are. Dropping the tennis balls, 1 exposure, but the flash firing multiple times, so you get the tennis balls multiple times. It's the kind of thing sometimes you see somebody swinging a bat or a tennis racket or something, and you see that effect. That's the multi effect. Here we've changed it to 5 times. And then here we've changed it to 5 times, but 70 hertz. So those 5 times are closer together. As you increase that hertz, it compacts the time that they fire in. And then less time. All right, let's talk about flash zoom. I know I'm going fast. Flash zoom is something that can be on auto or, as you can see here, 20, 24, 28, 35, 50, 70, 105, 135, 200. What that does is the flash itself zooms, it has a zoom effect. So if you're using a longer lens and you're on auto, it knows that and it zooms, so you get a better throw with your flash. You get more distance from it. Whereas if you have a wider angle lens, you get less distance because it needs to spread around. So instead of being focused, it's more spread. Most of the time, if you're on TTL and just running around, you probably want to be on auto. But if you want to see what that difference is, so here, 20 millimeters, 24, 28, 35, 50, 70, 105, 135, 200. I didn't change the power on the flash or the settings on the camera, but you can see on the 20 millimeter, it's exposed properly. 24, 28, 35, it's pretty close. As we zoom in, so as the light gets more focused, it gets much brighter because it's more effective at throwing the light. It's just not throwing the light around as much. So you can see on the 200, you can even see that beam of light because it's so narrow. The lens was set to 74 millimeters, by the way. So that 70 is pretty close to what it should be. Obviously not with exposure, but that's what the zoom is. So here we are at 200. Here we're on auto in the middle, and then auto at 2.8. 70 millimeters, and then auto, they're almost the same because the lens was at 72. And then here you can see a dramatic example with a wide angle outside, 20 millimeters, 200 millimeters. You can see that it threw the light much more effectively. Same thing here. However, if you're off camera, you don't have that same kind of control because the flash, when it's off camera, it knows that there's just things it doesn't know. So you can choose standard, center, or even illumination. So this is standard, center, even. And you can see that center is a little bit brighter. It's a narrower beam. Standard is not quite as bright. Even is the least bright. It just depends on what you have it set to. So if you're using it off camera, you can set it like that. All right, let's talk about sync speed, or what used to be called X-sync. Most cameras, I think, sync at 2/50th of a second. So on the left here, we have a camera with a flash at 1/200th of a second. On the right, we have a camera with a flash at 1/320th of a second. The sync speed for this camera was 250. So at 200, you're fine. At 320, you start to see that black line. That's the shutter. When you're above a camera's sync speed, the first curtain shutter starts moving and the rear curtain shutter starts moving as well. So the entire frame is never exposed at the same time. So if you're not careful about your sync speed, you can run into situations like this where you have the black line. If you're inside and it's only strobe, it's really easy to see. I have made that mistake outside where there's a lot of ambient and I don't realize until I'm looking at the pictures and see that the top of the frames is just a little bit dark. So you want to be careful about that. There's some ways around, which we'll talk about. But your sync speed may not matter the other way. If you're in a controlled environment, if you're inside, as I am here, all the lights are off. It's just no other light except the strobe, the Speedlight with the Alpha 100. The Alpha 100's sync speed is 1/400th of a second. I'm sorry, not Alpha 100. The Alpha 100 was the first Sony Alpha camera after they bought Minolta. The Alpha 1 sync speed is 1/400th of a second, 1/500th if you go into APS-C. So you'll notice at 0.5 seconds, 1/13th, 100, 0.3, 1/6, 1/25, 1/400th, all of them look basically the same. The reason for that is that the flash duration of the flash, the output of the flash, is the only thing affecting the exposure. The shutter speed doesn't matter. However, the shutter speed starts to matter if you go above your sync speed, so you see that black line, or if you're in an environment where there's ambient light, which we almost always are. So if you're photographing, say, in your living room and the room lights are on, you might not see a difference between 1/60th of a second, 1/125th, and 1/250th. But if you go to a 1/4 second, you might start seeing the lights in the room affecting your exposure. All right. So one of the ways to get past the sync speed is high-speed sync. High-speed sync is something where your camera and your flash are communicating, and the flash is firing multiple times in sync with the shutter moving so that everything gets exposed correctly. The downside of high-speed sync is you lose a lot of power because the flash is firing multiple times, right? If you're at full power and you want high-speed sync, the flash can't fire a true full power pop 10 times or whatever the high-speed sync is in, 1/500th of a second. It can't physically do that. So you lose power because it has to output a lower amount of light to make that work. So with high-speed sync, you can go to a higher shutter speed, but you also start having to go to a wider open aperture. So they start balancing each other out, depending on your situation. But we're going to go over some high-speed sync. So this is Me just moving my hand 1/40th of a second, f8, ISO 100, no flash. Everything's the same, but with a flash. Still, the hand is moving so quickly that even though flash will freeze motion, it's frozen my hand where it was, but the hand is still moving. And because there's so much ambient, you can see that motion in that blur. If we increase the shutter speed 1/80th, it gets better. 1/60th, it's better still. 1/250th, it's even yet still more better, but there's still some blur. 400th, it's getting there. But now 1/400th off camera, 1/800th, it's better still. 1/2500th, you can't see any motion at all. So if you look at the 1/400th, you can very closely, you can see there's still a little bit of motion. This is where high-speed sync comes into a useful situation. It's an overcast day, so I don't need all the power I can get. And I can boost that shutter speed to get it. You tend to need it to be direct. If you start putting modifiers on, you're probably losing too much power to be useful. But if you're trying to freeze motion, it's great. However, this is where the technology is absolutely incredible. A global shutter is like magic. So the Alpha 9 III, which they announced in the fall and then came out in early March, is magic. The Alpha 9 III has something called a global shutter. So what that is it has no physical shutter, it's just electronic. And that electronic shutter, which most cameras with electronic shutter can't use flash at all. There are some exceptions. I know one brand, for example, that doesn't have a physical shutter. It can still use a flash, but up to 1/250th, and then it can use high-speed sync past that. A global shutter doesn't need to use high-speed sync. A global shutter exposes the entire frame simultaneously. So every upper left, lower right, upper right, lower left, everything is exposed at the exact same time. So with a global shutter, you're able to use a flash at any shutter speed. So with the Alpha 9 III, for example, you can use it at up to 1/80,000th of a second with a flash. 800,000, 80,000th of a second. Most cameras top flash or top shutter speed in general is 8,000th. It can go up to 1/80,000th of a second with flash. However, for those of you who are nerdy like me, you may realize that the flash duration of your flash probably isn't an 80,000th of a second. So it does have a feature in the camera, which I'll go into more in a couple of weeks when we do the next part of this, where you can change the timing of the camera so that the curve of the flash duration of you're getting the peak of it when you are shooting. Anyway, it is absolutely magic. I think a lot of people don't understand how cool this is. So here we have the Alpha 9 III, the 2470 G Master 2. A little self-portrait I did of myself shooting into the sun at f2.8 ISO 250 with the HVL f60 RM2 into an umbrella at 8th power at a 32,000th of a second. So a Speedlight at 8th power in an umbrella was overpowering the sun on a sunny day. That is incredible. So your standard battery-powered strobe, which these days is usually 500 watts, can't do this. It's absolutely amazing. And at 1/8 power. So you're able to take something that's quite small, like a Speedlight, and go outside and overpower the sun with the Alpha 9 III. I think it's wonderfully exciting. It's super cool. And to give you a sense, on the left is at 2/50th of a second. On the right is the 1/32,000th of a second. Like that's how dramatic the difference is. So if I wanted to use a flash or something else prior to this, I couldn't shoot at 2/8, or you're just trying to do high-speed sync, but it's underpowered. This is 3200th of a second with the Speedlight into an umbrella of my daughter at f4 on a sunny day. 2/8, 2000th of a second. So he's in shadow, which is why the light's so dramatic, but I'm still holding that blue sky because I'm able to boost the shutter speed. You know, one of the ways you might use a flash outside is you go into shadow, you add your light so that the sunlight's not impacting it. But when you would do that in the past, the blue sky would have turned white. Very, very cool. All right, so let's talk about building a photo with some speedlights. So here we have a little bud in Prospect Park. The Alpha 1 90mm 2.8 G macro, 1/13th of a second, f11, ISO 200, just available light. It's fine. Here we are using direct flash. I think it's more interesting. The white sky in the background, not interesting. Bringing that down a little. Now I've moved the light to the side. I think this is more interesting still because we're getting a little gradation. When the flash is direct, it can be a little flat. Moving a little bit more. Changing the shutter speed so that the background is getting really dramatic. Really, really dramatic. Reducing the flash and adding a second light to the side. Moving the side light to be a backlight. Reducing the power a little because this is too much. I think that looks kind of cool. And you wouldn't know this was outside, which I think is cool. So that's the setup there. Direct flash into side light. Similar thing, direct flash. Direct flash boosting the shutter speed dramatically. So 1/20th of a second, 1/160th. Direct flash on camera, moving a side light so you get that edge light there. Adding a warming filter to the side light. Adding a green filter so that the greens really saturate. Another cool thing about Speedlights is because they're so small, I frequently, if it's raining, I just put a gallon Ziploc over it. Use it outside in the rain, no problem. So we've got a HVLF 46 RM left on the rim as a rim light, 60 RM2 on the right as a main, lowering the power on the main, raising the light on the main, adding some warmth on the main, changing the camera's white balance so that I don't look quite so warm. Now it feels like it's nighttime, even though this was all during the day. All right. Some examples of speedlights in the studio, just speedlight in an umbrella. Direct speedlights just with gels, blue light on the left, red light on the right. Using a combination of speedlight and a long exposure with a flashlight. Speedlight and long exposure. Speedlight and long exposure. All right. And then some more real world examples. So no speedlight on the left, no light at all. Adding a speedlight on the right. Obviously the one on the left is too dark. If I were to expose that properly for her, then the background gets too bright. So just adding that speedlight on the right. And because it's a slightly longer exposure, you get an effect I really like, which is when it's a little bit windy and the ends of the hair get a little wispy. Speedlight to balance with the sunlight in the background without the light. No light on the left, speedlight on the right, also in a small umbrella. Speedlight on the left. No speedlight. Speedlight. No speedlight. You can see how adding just a little bit of a light really can make a big difference. I think one of the things that people overlook is it is true that cameras now are absolutely incredible with high ISOs, so that you don't need as much light. But if the light isn't good, it's still not good. It's still better to have good light. You just need less quantity of light, of good light, to make it work. If it's still, you know, ugly or too direct or too top down or whatever, adding some light, controlling your light is still a good answer. Light on the right, that's direct. Direct here on the left. Oh no, it's an umbrella. You can see the umbrella right there. Also, speedlights outside can be useful, and because they're small, you can hide them. So no light. Here you can see there's a light on the left behind this tree in the front. There's also a light in the back helping to light the trees in the background. If you look, everything is darker back there. It's a little brighter here. No light, adding a speed light. So this is where what we talked about with the global shutter. Now with the Alpha 9.3, I would have boosted the shutter speed on this to be much higher so that the background, that sky has some tone into it instead of just being white. I still think it works. If you compare this, where her face is pretty dramatically shadowed, to this, where I've added some light, it's much better, but it would be cool to have been able to boost that shutter speed. This is using a Speedlight on the left. It's on a long pole with a Manfrotto EasyBuck Speedlight 2. Here we've got a Speedlight in the back doing that rim light on his hair, and then a little small softbox, that small Manfrotto softbox on a Speedlight on the right. Similar thing here. Similar thing here. Here you can see there's a light clamped to that girder on the right. There's a light in the background. So, oh, that's not really the right picture to show it with. So we've got that light on the girder lighting her here. There's that light on the left coming in from the left. And there's also a light down the stairs shooting up to do a little bit of tiny bit of separation. Oh, here we go. You can see it there. Two speed lights here, an edge light, and a light in a small softbox on the right. This is what it looks like with no speed light. A little bit dark. And here you can see what they look like. Similar thing. A little too bright on the rim light, lowering it, making it not quite as dramatic. You can see the difference here. Just adding that little kick. You can see it there on the left. Speedlight on a tall stand. You don't need much if your subject's in shadow to just add a little bit of a kick. Similar thing here. To me, the one on the right, you wouldn't know that was lit if you couldn't see the other one. It's just enough of a fill light with the Speedlight to fill in the shadows, so it's not as dramatically dark as the one on the left, but it doesn't feel super lit. There's the EasyBuck Speedlight 2. See the difference. Sometimes it's fun to overexpose. Speedlight with an umbrella, Speedlight with an umbrella, Speedlight with an umbrella. All right, let's see if there are questions. That was a lot of slides I just went through.
A lot of information.
Yes. And there's stuff I cut out.
That's for next time. We do have a question in from Vincent joining us on YouTube.
Okay.
Hey, Tony, I'm using the f2.8 RM on a Sony a7R4 in TTL mode for some fill flash. I'm sorry, the f28 RM. I'm over here reading it like it's a flash or like it's a lens. Which is the correct white balance to use? Auto, flash, or manual 5500 Kelvin?
So if you're running around, if you're using it as a fill flash and your situation is changing, I would do auto. If you're using it as the main light, and the circumstances aren't changing, I would probably do flash. What I really do is shoot in RAW and just shoot a gray card. But if you don't want to do that, I would probably put it on flash in that situation.
What metering mode do you use, Tony, when you're using TTL? I know in the past, it's like I've gotten inconsistencies. That's when I fully went to just starting using everything manual, so I can kind of just control and keep a nice standard set. But for the situations where you would use TTL, are you using, your metering, is it going to be spot metering, or using more of like an evaluative where it's taking a general reading of the scene?
The multi-weighted evaluate, there's center weighted evaluative. Right? Did I say that right? But yeah, I'm not trying to overthink it too much. If I really, really need it to be exact, I'll do what you do and just put everything in manual. And most of the time, if I'm using Speedlights, I'm doing that. The situations where I'm not, things are moving too quickly for me to get too precious about trying to do spot metering.
Okay.
You know, I'm shooting an event or something where stuff is constantly changing. And so I'll put it on center weighted evaluative, so that it's most likely to be the most useful in the widest range of situations. And I'm shooting raw, so I'll just fix it later if it's a little bit off.
Exactly. And you have a lot of, especially now, a lot of latitude, a lot more latitude, especially than we did back years ago.
Absolutely.
Well, that looks like we covered the questions. Of course, Tony's going to be back for 2 more parts in this series. So if you guys haven't gotten to catch up, we did drop some links to part 1 and 2. And if you do have any questions that you didn't think of, he's not going anywhere. He's going to be back for more. Tony, huge thank you to you. And of course, a huge thank you to Sony for hosting this entire series. And to all of our viewers out there, thank you guys as well. That is it. Another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space, now in the books. Catch y'all next time.
Thanks, everybody.